Good evening. Here we are, about to discuss Apocalypse Now, the fantastic movie by Francis Ford Coppola about the quest to find a deranged warlord living in the jungles of Cambodia during the Vietnam War, based on the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, the Polish writer who lived in the 1800s, who managed to write some of the greatest books in the English language as a second language. So there you go. There's something to aim for. I'll give you a bit of... we're going to talk about the background of the film. We're going to summarize the plot, talk about the film styles and techniques, talk about all the mad actors in the film, talk about the locations. I've actually lived in a couple of the places featured in the film. And at the end, we're going to talk about the themes that are being discussed in the film. So first of all, this film was released in 1979. It was started filming, I think, in 1976, one year after the end of the Vietnam War, which the Vietnam War had a big psychological effect on America, I think. It was the first war that they actually lost. It was a very unpopular war. Half of the country didn't even think they should be there. Towards the end, even more, probably. It was basically a proxy war. The Americans were fighting the Russians in Vietnam. Kind of the same as the Korean War. Two superpowers, instead of going at it against each other, just as well in a way, seeing they have vast quantities of nuclear devices. The Russians backed the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were actually, I didn't realize this, they were from South Vietnam is quite distinct. The North Vietnamese are quite different from the South Vietnamese, and they think of themselves as quite different. But the Viet Cong were the communist army from South Vietnam. So, like I said, it happened only a few years after the end of the Vietnam War. The film, like I said, is based on Heart of Darkness, which is quite a very important book in some ways. It talks about a lot of important things. In the book, it's set in Africa, and it's centered around... let's just talk about, let's summarize the plot. Okay, so in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, there is a rogue colonel called Colonel Kurtz, who was first in his class in the military academy in West Point and all that, and he was destined to be an admiral, or not an admiral, but a general, 4-star general. And then he went rogue. He formed his own sort of militia. They were very, very effective at fighting the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, but their methods were deemed to be unsound. That's what it says in the film. So the top brass of the American army pulls in Martin Sheen, who is a special ops army captain, and sends him on a mission to go up the river, one of the rivers in Vietnam, I don't know if it's the Mekong or whatever, up into the highlands of Cambodia to find Colonel Kurtz and to terminate his command with extreme prejudice. In other words, to, whack him. That is the basic plot. There's a lot of other stuff that happens on the journey, the quest, the classic quest that you have in a lot of great myths and all the rest of it, until they finally meet up with Kurtz. Now, the styles and techniques of the film are quite different from your typical big budget action movie. There's a lot of kind of poetic imagery, and yet terrifying at the same. Like there's very famous, the helicopters, the sound of the helicopters can kind of live in your psyche after you hear them. And, they'll have strip bombing of jungle, where it's actually quite beautiful to look at, and it's filmed to look beautiful because I think they film it. It's actually in slow motion. They don't have the sound. They're playing some sort of classical music in the background as it's being bombed. So he uses the techniques of a sort of art film in a war movie. So it's not like your typical John Wayne war movie, that's for sure. It's a lot more poetic. There's a lot of, high action, loudness, contrasted with much more of a subdued soundscape, I mean, a lot of films have that, and this one does it very effectively. You've got the calm before the storm, and then like a big eruption of action happening. So, unlike some action movies, which are just non-stop action that you become sort of immune to it, inured to it, with this one, when there is some sort of catastrophic event, it really has an impact. This also has a very... the soundtrack is not that great, but there's a very good use of the band The Doors. I'm sure you've heard of their song The End, which is a very ominous song with a real climax leading up to the end of the song. Jim Morrison, I found out, actually sort of knew Francis Ford Coppola. They went to the same film school in UCLA around the same time. I didn't actually know that. I just found that out from Wikipedia. So it's got the logistics of a massive action film. I mean, there's lots of really, like out of a Steven Spielberg movie. The fighting between the troops looks very, very authentic, and yet there's other things going on that are very, very different from a typical action movie. So it's kind of like Hollywood at its best. It's poetic, it's deep, and it's not boring. It's also very exciting and gripping. So it's definitely one of the best films of all time. Definitely, most definitely one of the. It could be, maybe maybe the best film of all time. It's very hard to find a film that would beat it in all round comparison. The actors involved are Martin Sheen, who's half Spanish, half Irish, grew up in a working class family. His mother died when he was only 11, so he had quite a traumatic upbringing. He was also an alcoholic during the filming of the movie. Dennis Hopper is in it, who was also a massive substance abuser. I think during the film of it, he was also off his head on alcohol and cocaine for most of it. You got Marlon Brando, who was probably wired into the ice cream and cake. That was his particular poison. So, I mean, these are pretty heavy hitters, great actors. Sheen's performance in it is very low-key. He's got a ruthless quality about him, and he's standoffish to what's happening around him, keeps his cool demeanor. His voice is used as a voiceover. The voiceover, the narration was written by a guy called Michael Herr, who was not Herr as in on the chinny chin chin, but Herr as in Herr Hitler. He was a war correspondent, and he was over in Vietnam, and the narration is based on his book Dispatches, so it has their own unique kind of quality. A very American quality, describing what's going on during the war, very cynical, and Sheen plays it low-key most of the movie, if not all of it. He's kind of... he has a nobility about him. The very first scene we see him, he's in a hotel room, drinking, going through some sort of traumatic, nervous breakdown. And this was he was really drunk. They filmed him in a hotel room when he was incredibly drunk. And right at the end of the scene, you can see him just weeping and like, you know, gushing all these tears all out of him. And perhaps he was remembering his mother dying or something. It's really, you know, it's not acting, it's real. So to have that as a beginning of a war movie is pretty unusual. You don't get that in war movies usually. You know, it's all about heroes and villains and all the rest of it. So to see him do that. Then he's sent off, he meets the top brass and he's sent off and he gets on the boat, and the people on the boat are just, there's a mixed bag of people. You got the captain, who's a black guy, who doesn't really want to be doing this particular quest because for obvious reasons it's highly dangerous and he doesn't see why he has to do it. Then there's a sort of young, you know, a lot of the, let's face it, a lot of the soldiers went to Vietnam are about 19 or 20, which is, you know, just a late teenager. I mean, it's like, I can't imagine doing that when I was 19 or 20. No chance, or any age, to be honest. There's this young surfer guy, and then there's a guy from New Orleans who is a chef. He's kind of, he's not a good old boy, he's kind of a Cajun or something. And then there's Lawrence Fishburne, who was 14 when they started filming the film. He lied about his age, he pretended he was 17. He was only 14, but he's a big guy. So he looks about 17, but, you know, that was his first role, I think. And he plays a young African-American guy who's really like a young kid, just hopping all over the place. And they're a big part of the plot, the interactions they have with each other, how they handle the stress and the war that they're in. So there's they're in it. You know, there's Marlon Brando. Well, let's get to when they finally actually meet up with. They make their way to the encampment where Colonel Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando, is ensconced. They meet Dennis Hopper, who plays this mad war photographer, who's kind of a hippie guy with a headband, and he talks about 100 miles an hour, and he's very manic, and has some of the best lines in the film. Before they get there, there's also Robert Duvall, who plays Lieutenant Kilgore, the sort of arch example of a mad American army officer who thinks he's in the cavalry from the 1800s or something, or a cowboy. He wears a cowboy hat and everything. And there's a brilliant scene where they have to go up the river. They go up the sea and then they go into the river, and it's a Viet Cong area, so it's very dangerous for them. So they need Captain Kilgore to go in there and bomb the hell out of the place where the Viet Cong are. And he's not really sure if he wants to do that until he finds out that there is really good surfing, and that is what makes him decide to help them out, because he's obsessed with surfing, and especially as he hears one of the guys on the boat with Martin Sheen, one of the soldiers, is an expert surfer from California. So there's all this death and destruction and people dying, all for the totally inane reason of having a place to surf, which is where the line "Charlie, don't surf" comes from. Charlie means the Vietnamese, Victor Charlie, VC, Viet Cong. It means the Viet Cong. So that was the nickname that the soldiers had. So Charlie, don't surf. He also uses Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries to go in with the helicopters and devastate this village. And it's quite, it's one of the best scenes in film history, and really parlays just how horrible war must be if you're in the middle of it. I mean, I certainly felt like that. Just, he says, Captain Kilgore, Lieutenant, whatever he was, says, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. I mean, talk about gallows humor. And he's not even joking when he's saying it. So there's a lot of critique, I think, of that gung-ho American jingoism in the film. And I think there was a lot of that around in the 70s after the disappointment of the Vietnam War. I don't know if disappointment is the right word. So there's lots of great scenes. There's another scene where there's a USO exhibit, concert for the troops, and it's set on this big platform in the middle of the river, and these playmates of the year come down in a helicopter and prance around to the Creedence Clearwater Revival, and CCR. I think they're kind of the house band of the Vietnam War. Whenever there's a film about the Vietnam War, they're on the soundtrack. There's maybe something about their songs are always a bit on the bayou and in the jungle and all that, so they're always in. And they're a great band, so they usually have great songs. So it's just really surreal, and it, I think there's a critique of it's just the American culture, so over the top. I mean, it's very dynamic and exciting American culture, but totally, and kind of mad at the same time. I can't really see that happening in a British movie. They'd all be sitting around complaining about the tea, or not having enough milk, or or looking like milk, or sunburn. That's probably about 90% of the conversation if the British actually went out to Vietnam, which they didn't. Sitting around sipping gin and tonics. Whereas America is not like that. It's a very dynamic, it's sort of like, imagine a war run by, WWE. They know how to put on a show. So there's a lot of ironic, dark, black humor in this film, as well as gut-wrenching tragedy as well, stuff that happens. Another great scene is Chef really wants to get mangoes. Chef is the guy from New Orleans on the boat, and him and Martin Sheen go into the jungle to look for mangoes, and boom, they're confronted with a tiger. And they have tigers in Southeast Asia, and I just, you just showing them, these city boys, that they are really confronted by nature, the way human beings used to live. I think that's a big theme. We'll talk about the themes later. Another great scene is when they actually get to the encampment where Colonel Kurtz is. They are greeted by a whole phalanx of natives who are painted white. And it looked a bit like the Amazon River and Amazon natives rather than Cambodian, although they have similarity of features as well. So that was, and they all part as the boat comes in. And probably the most famous scene is when they meet, Martin Sheen finally meets Marlon Brando, and Marlon Brando's doing his thing. He's shaved his head bald. Supposedly Marlon Brando, when he showed up for the filming, he hadn't even read Heart of Darkness or anything. I guess he just had a certain, that's a word, laziness about him. But then he would freelance it, wing it as he got along, and he also came up with great performances. So you can't really be his method. There was method in his madness. And Martin Sheen meets him, and Marlon Brando's doing the thing. He's stroking. What I remember when I first saw it, he's stroking his bald head. And when I first saw it, not many people had bald heads. And he's discussing about how I heard it was an urban myth of how the Viet Cong, the Americans came in and vaccinated this village, all the children, for polio, and after they left, the Viet Cong came in and cut the arms off of all the kids that had been vaccinated. I think it's an urban myth. It's not actually true, but the way he describes it is going, if I had 100 men like that, we could win this war. Well, he's just talking about you have to be brutal and ruthless to win a war. And you can't let the politicians and bureaucrats run things in a way. He was saying that, if you were to do that, there would be a lot less loss of life in tragedy because you get it over with quickly instead of dilly-dallying around, or that's basically his take on it, I guess. The hawk, the ultimate hawk, as opposed to dove sensibility. And so they meet each other, and Colonel Kurtz kind of takes a shine to Captain Willard. That's the captain, played by Martin Sheen. And he kind of insinuates in a way that he wants to be murdered somehow, and so Martin Sheen paints himself in a camouflage war paint, comes out of the water with a knife, and kills Colonel Kurtz in his where he lives. A lot of technical words I can't seem to come up with. He, all to the sounds of the Doors, Light My Fire, and all happening. There was actually, it was filmed in the Philippines, not in, because Vietnam and Cambodia wouldn't have been safe places to film. They actually filmed the ritual sacrifice of an ox or a water buffalo, and you see in the film them as they come to the climax of Light My Fire, not Light My Fire, the end by the Doors. They slice into bits this water buffalo in real life, and it's really, really, really affecting imagery, to say the least. I mean, I don't think many people have actually seen that before. Now, it was filmed in the Philippines, but I've actually lived in Vietnam, and I lived in Cambodia too, so I know the places a bit. I saw this movie way before I actually ever visited those places, and I thought, oh, the jungle was really scary and malignant and all that. But actually, after visiting them and going up rivers on boats, they're very beautiful and peaceful. Certainly not like how the jungle was portrayed in this film. When it was being filmed, it was from, I guess, 76 to 78, 79. It took a long time to film. There's a great documentary called Hearts of Darkness, which is which is a documentary about the filming of the film, and it's right up there with the film as a brilliant film to watch. But when the filming was going on, the Khmer Rouge, the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia was happening, which is one of the worst, darkest days in human history. I know quite a bit about that. 4 years of just torture, just people living in, their next door neighbor denouncing them and them getting taken out and murdered, bludgeoned to death and tortured. When I lived there, I knew people that had been, their entire families wiped out. They were 1 year old, and their parents were murdered, so they grew up as an orphan. And I know people like this. Anybody over a certain age had to go through it. And Vietnam, I lived in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City is Saigon. And you definitely I felt a little bit of, like maybe the way a German would feel going to Britain 20 years after the war. Like you feel a bit of hostility being a white person in Vietnam. It's also, they've had a very difficult history, and the young people I met are much more open to foreigners, maybe. But I feel from some of the older people a certain hostility. And in Hanoi, you will have like a B-52 bomber, like in the museum. Not in a museum, they have lots of lakes in Hanoi, and the tail end of the B-52 will be sticking out of the lake, and they'll use it as a museum or something. So they're quite proud of the fact that they beat the Americans, this massive superpower that they managed to beat. And it's funny enough, you do see a lot of people wearing T-shirts with American flags on it and stuff like that for some reason. I don't know why. So one thing I learned about this is that I think I may have said that okay, let's talk about the themes. I think the themes, what Conrad was trying to get across in Heart of Darkness, is the thin veneer over civilization and how it doesn't take much for us to just lose our civility and turn into, savages or barbarians. I think especially in the 1800s, they viewed like people who lived in hunter-gatherer communities as, that's what they called them, savages. And whereas now I think we have a much more benign view of people like that, and maybe think that we're much more murderous than they are. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But so the idea of Heart of Darkness is just, I think, the losing of how extraordinary circumstances can reveal atavism, like when you revert back to something your ancestors were many generations before, and within our civilization, it's always possible for us to descend into barbarity. So you've got this famous quote from it, the horror, and the ironic thing is that actually was happening in Cambodia when they were filming this. I mean, just there was unbelievable horror going on in Cambodia, and with this, there are other themes in the Apocalypse Now. I think American culture, the kind of, like I said, the dynamism and yet slightly ridiculous quality of it. You get the Kilgore guy with the cowboy hat who just kills a bunch of people just so he can surf. And and then the Playboy playmates, and the feeling that of the American culture just bulldozing people in Vietnam who are just trying to live. They're in a civil war, but they've all of a sudden got this massive superpower just bulldozing over them with the untold resources and weapons, just and sort of blithely bombing the hell out of them for no reason, really. Seeing that, it's not as if Vietnam had invaded America, just America was fighting Russia in a proxy war. I mean, they were worried about communism, which is basically, I don't even think they were just worried about Russia and communism spreading. That's what it was all about. It was one tribe against another. Western interests against Russian interests. So that's what I have to say about Apocalypse Now.